This is the kingdom principle. Freely give as you have freely received. This is what empowers you to forgive. You've received love, give it freely. You've received provision, give it freely. You've received joy, give it freely. You've received forgiveness, give it freely. How many times do we charge others and make them pay for something that we freely received? What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the Andrew Ramon Show. I'm so happy that you've tuned in, maybe listening on your favorite, platforms like Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher. We're like basically in all of those. Or maybe you're watching on YouTube. Either way, thanks for tuning in. Did you know that we have even more episodes for you to actually enjoy, like more than 100 other episodes? I know it feels like a whole Netflix gallery, from like talking about relationships and money to like controversial topics of transgenderism and race to insightful and inspiring interviews. I know there's something for you to enjoy, for it to encourage you and challenge you, because in this show, we always like to go deep. I know that really sounded like an ad, didn't it? Did you know that we have more than 100 episodes? I know. Hey, it's my show. I got to plug myself in. Go to our YouTube gallery, go to podcasts, and listen to some other episodes because I know you will enjoy it. Hey, before we go into today's episode, don't forget that if you're in the DFW area, register today for our free Question It event, a 1-hour Q&A event where the show goes on the road. If you're skeptical, bring your questions. If you're struggling with your doubts, let's have the necessary conversations. Or if you want to learn how to defend your faith with reason and apply it with relevancy, sign up today. I know that was such a confusing ad because it was like such an adventure and an emotional, and then all of a sudden it was like a family gathering event. Okay. All in all, that was the ad for the free Question It event that we're having March 18th. It's a 1-hour Q&A event. You don't want to miss it. We already got several signups, so go ahead, sign up now. All the links and all that information will be in the show notes. Today, we're going to have an uncomfortable conversation. Yep, I said it. It's going to be a little uncomfortable. I know some of you already got uncomfortable because you heard the word uncomfortable. But before we get into it, I want to ask you, how do you handle uncomfortable conversations? Do you shy away from them? Do you skip to the next video in the next episode because you're just not good with these type of talks? Or maybe you tense up and you forget to breathe. That's literally me. Like, I hate kind of conflict. I hate like uncomfortable conversation, which is kind of funny because we have them a lot in this show. So yeah, it tells you that it's kind of forcing myself when it comes to that. But I do that. I tense up and I forget to breathe, and all of a sudden I'm like, okay, I can breathe. Well, this is kind of one of those episodes. Throughout this time together, I will share with you the stories of Chris Williams and Cameron White, as well as Jessica Simpson. And although you may not recognize some of these names, by the end of this episode, you will not forget them. A few weeks ago, someone suggested that we talk about the power of forgiveness. Now, the word forgiveness is a term that's often used within a religious setting, and I think aptly so. Along with it, you might hear terms like sin, grace, letting go, redemption. Well, today we're having this uncomfortable conversation, not for the sake of just having a conversation or for the sake of it just being like a hard talk to have. No. We're having this for the sake of change. Because think about this. When you're uncomfortable, you actually switch positions, right? When you're sitting down and you kind of get uncomfortable, you kind of switch over to the other butt cheek. That's kind of what happens. Well, today we're asking the tough questions about forgiveness. We're going to ask, what is forgiveness? We talk about it often, especially in church, but what really is it? Is it just a religious term that has no use in our daily lives? Can we really forgive and forget, or is that just superficial? Is it fair to forgive the unforgivable? And what does it mean to forgive ourselves? Why is forgiveness an uncomfortable topic to begin with? Because, think about it. If I were talking about IRA investments and stocks, maybe it wouldn't be such an uncomfortable topic. But the reason we tense up and we forget to breathe a little bit is because it's real and it hits very close to home. The only reason forgiveness exists is because there's something to forgive. And that something can be real and painful. You don't have to live a long time to get hurt, whether it's by family, friends, loved ones, random strangers on the street who just kind of look at you and look the other way and you're like, oh my gosh, I'm already offended. I don't know what it may be. Or it can be just by life circumstances or even yourself. In fact, I didn't mention anything too specific, and chances are you've already thought of someone who's hurt you, who's done you wrong. In cases of physical hurt, you can carry the pain with you with marks. But for many, it's not noticeable on the outside that we carry some hurt. The evidence is the pain within. Words spoken from those that we love that marks us, or it could be the words that should have been said but were never said. Maybe from a dad or a mom telling you that they're proud of you, that they love you. It could be the absence of a father or a mother, or the absence of a loved one. And some of the pain we experience is like a bruise. The main injury is internally. Here's where we arrive at forgiveness. What is forgiveness? I mean, is it just a combination of like magical words, I forgive you, and ta-da, it's all happy and butterflies after that? Not exactly. Matthew 18, Jesus gives us a parable to illustrate forgiveness. He says this, therefore the kingdom of God is like a king who wanted to settle accounts with his servants. As he began the settlement, they brought to him a man who owed him 10,000 bags of gold. That's a lot of money. Since he was not able to pay it, the master ordered that he, his wife, and his children, and all that he owned be sold to repay the debt. At this time, the servant fell on his knees before him and begged, be patient with me, he said. I will pay back everything. The servant's master took pity on him and canceled the debt and let him go. Forgiveness is like canceling a debt. Maybe you feel that people owe you something. Could be rightly so. Maybe it's because someone took it from you. Your joy, your smile, your innocence. You haven't been the same since they did this or said that. You're holding a balance sheet, just waving it at them and saying, this is all that you've owed me. This is all that you've taken from me. And you won't let it go until they pay it back by asking for forgiveness. It might not even be a person that you're holding it against. Maybe it feels like life itself owes you something. That can be one of the reasons that we don't forgive so easily, is because people don't ask for forgiveness very easily either. So it becomes a stalemate. It becomes like, okay, you say it first. Well, I'm not forgiving until you ask for forgiveness. Well, I'm not asking for forgiveness because I don't feel like it was such a big deal. So it becomes a stalemate. It becomes something that we're stuck. And we say things like, I just don't feel ready to forgive. When I feel ready, I'll do it. Can you relate? But what if forgiveness is not so much in the feelings, but in the decision? What if it begins with a decision and then your feelings follow? Chris Williams found himself needing to answer this question on a winter night in 2007. Chris and his family were driving home from the ice cream shop, what was such a nice family day. And as they made their way through an underpass, he saw the headlights of a vehicle coming at them at such a high speed that he couldn't avoid it. It was in that moment that their vehicle was T-boned by an intoxicated driver. Chris shares that in that crash, his wife, who was pregnant with their fifth child, passed away as she got most of the impact. And it doesn't stop there, sadly. In the back seat, Benjamin, who was almost 12, and Anna also died in the impact. Only him and his youngest survived. To be honest, when I was hearing his story on the podcast, my heart sank as Chris shared his story. I mean, there are no words to describe this type of tragedy. And Chris says that while being stuck in his car as the ambulances were coming to them in that crash, he heard a voice saying to him, "Let it go." Wow. Let it go. And in that moment, he forgave the other driver. Did you catch that? In the moment of chaos, in the moment that you've just been hit, you realize your wife next to you has passed away. She's no longer moving. Your two kids in the back have also died. There's only one remaining. He's severely injured. And you hear the words, "Let it go," And in that moment, he decided to forgive the other driver. Later that night, as the ambulance took him and his surviving son to the hospital, police apprehended Cameron White, the 17-year-old kid responsible for the accident. Cameron shares how it wasn't until the following morning, waking up in the detention center, that he fully realized, once the alcohol had faded out, that he fully realized what he had done. He was mortified. I mean, just the following day after the accident, Chris then publicly forgave Cameron. Chris shares that as he was in the hospital, they told him that it was a 17-year-old boy who was intoxicated that hit him, and compassion filled his heart. That's unreal to hear of. And he publicly forgave Cameron. When the court hearing actually arrived, and that's when Cameron saw Chris for the very first time. He saw the man who Cameron, was responsible for the death of most of his family. Expecting a face of anger and hate, Cameron hesitantly turned around to make eye contact with Chris sitting in the audience. And his face was one of compassion. During his time in the juvenile detention center, Cameron's therapist suggested that he and Chris should meet in person. I mean, how do you meet a person who you just are responsible for such hurt and pain in their lives? But they did. And when that day arrived, Cameron asked Chris the burning question in all of our minds: how could you forgive me? Chris's response was simple and powerful. He said, "It's because of Christ." Wow. It's because of Christ. Today, 13 years later, Chris continues to be a mentor in Cameron's life. And they have a deep relationship exemplifying the story of forgiveness and restoration. What in the world? As I heard this, there were many times in this story where I was crying just listening to this story. I mean, when asked about forgiving, if forgiveness was just a one-time thing, Chris said that it was a decision that he took, but every day he had to remind himself of that decision. And Chris shares this powerful truth that a lot of people, unfortunately, don't really understand, is that you are the main beneficiary of forgiveness. See, a lot of us think that forgiving someone is letting the other person off the hook. So we don't want to, right? We don't want to think that somehow what they did was not real, what they did didn't matter, what they did wasn't bad. So we're like, I'm not letting you off the hook. I'm not going to forgive you. You're actually not doing it for them. As Chris shares, forgiveness can actually be for your benefit as well. Some of us need to forgive for us. And that's not some superficial self-help statement. You guys know that in this show, I'm not a huge fan of the quote-unquote self-help culture that just says, just think about you and your own ambiguous term of self-help. No. We're not talking about that. But forgiveness, you are the main beneficiary of it. You can actually forgive for yourself. I feel like there's someone listening here that you've been holding on to something. You've been holding on to a grudge. And I'm not saying that what you're holding on to is not necessarily justified. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes we do make bigger deals of something that someone did by accident. But as Chris says, you're the main beneficiary. I think it's time for you to forgive for you so that you can move forward. Because many times the other person has moved forward with their lives and we're here the ones stuck, the ones hurt, and we're thinking by not forgiving them, we're actually holding them back. No, you're not. You're holding yourself back. Unforgiveness is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to be harmed. We say, well, I'm just not sure if I feel ready. Well, if I'm honest with you, I don't know when you will feel ready. But why not forgive today and let healing actually begin? Why not start today and then let the process begin and let your feelings follow afterwards? And if you just wait till, well, I'm not going to forgive until they deserve it, until I see that they've done enough to pay me back. But if you wait till the other person deserves it, is it really forgiveness to begin with? I mean, Jesus shares in Matthew chapter 6, if you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners love those who love them. If you do good to those who do good to you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners do the same. If you lend to those from whom you expect repayment, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners, expecting a repaid in full. Then he says this, but love your enemies, do good to them, and lend to them, expecting nothing in return. Then your reward will be great, and you will be sons of the Most High, for he is kind to the ungrateful and the wicked. Be merciful just as your Father is merciful. One of the problems and one of the reasons we struggle to forgive is because in that conversation, when we're trying to forgive someone, we expect something in return. And that can be a false expectation. And I'm not saying that it's right for someone not to all of a sudden, break down and say, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. But many times when you forgive someone, either they've moved on, they haven't really thought about it very much, and we're expecting that quid pro quo. I forgive you, and I'm expecting you to feel the same way and ask for forgiveness, but many times it's not that way. So when you forgive, expect nothing in return. Let them deal with God. Let them deal with what's owed to them. But for you, forgive and expect nothing in return. Now, does that mean that you should just forget what they did? Because I've heard that before. I've heard forgive but never forget, right? Forgive them, but you should never forget what they did to you. Should you just forget and go back to the way the things were? And we understand in some situations it can be extremely difficult, and definitely in situations of abuse. Things like, what, do you just forget that they abused you and you remain with them? Well, we all understand that going through therapy and going to those, many times you do have to forgive, and then you have to create severance. You have to create boundaries. The phrase forgive and forget can sometimes give the idea that as simple as 1, 2, 3, A, B, C, blah, 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 and do, re, mi, something like that goes the song. Like if it was just so easy, like, okay, just forgive and forget. Like boom, all of a sudden everything is done. And if you haven't forgotten, there's something wrong with you. Because I get a feeling that as you listen and we talk about it, that maybe there's something that you've said in your heart you've forgiven, but you haven't quite forgotten. It's like when you have that friend who keeps forgetting his wallet every single time, and you're like, well, forgive and forget. Well, $100 later, you're still paying for the guy's lunch because he always forgets his wallet. Well, when you forgive, you actually have to sometimes face the situation, maybe have a conversation with that friend and say, hey man, look, I don't mind paying for you at all. Like, you're my friend. I love you, bro. I want to know, is everything okay? Because I've just noticed that you keep forgetting your wallet. Like, is everything okay? How can I help you? And then that way you kind of get to talk to him, and he's like, well, actually this happened or that happened. And you can actually face the situation, and then you can bring closure and actually move forward. Because a lot of times just saying forgive and forget, we don't understand that there's sometimes a process in between those two things, and it's called facing it and bringing closure. Because when we do, it allows us to forget more easily. Because just saying the words will not necessarily make you forget. I think we're all witnesses of that. Some things require closure. Maybe there's a conversation that you need to have. Again, I'm not saying the situations of like you've left a toxic and abusive relationship and now I'm asking you to go back to that person. No, I'm not saying that. But there are times in our lives that there's a conversation that you need to have in order to bring closure. Because you have to feel, and this is what we think, right? You have to feel to have that conversation, but sometimes you have to decide to have that. You have the feeling like you've actually forgiven them, but it's hard to actually forget it, and it keeps coming back to your mind because you haven't had that closure. We need to bring closure. In fact, God does something amazing when you bring closure. We can find ourselves actually being able to move past it and leave that hurt part of our past. Jessica Simpson is a well-known American singer, actress, businesswoman, fashion designer. I recently learned about her, but when I was talking with my mom, she definitely knew who she was. And, she started her music career at an early age of about, I think it was 17, back in 97, signing with Columbia Records. Starring in several hit TV shows and movies. She also launched what was called the Jessica Simpson collection back in 2005, 2007. And most recently in 2020, she released her memoir called Open Book. Very powerful, where she shares about her story. Now, she grew up as a preacher's kid, actually, singing in the choir on Sundays. And what she goes on to say next in her memoir and in podcasts that I've listened to, you wouldn't really expect out of a successful woman like herself, but you kind of learn that everybody got a story, right? You and I, we all have a story. Every so often, they would visit some close friends of their family. And unknown to her parents for many years, she would actually experience sexual abuse from one of the daughters of that family. And this went on for a long time. And of course, like a victim of abuse, there's secrecy, there's shame, and that kind of does not allow you to share. And sometimes you feel like if you share, you're going to be misunderstood. But she finally decided to confide with one of her school friends. That school friend turned the story around and blamed her as the abuser. And she later learned that even that friend herself was being abused. Finally, one car ride, Jessica blurted out what was going on to her parents, and her parents responded immediately. They were supportive. They stopped visiting that family friend. And later in life, unfortunately, Jessica carried that pain with her, she says. She carried it and it came out in a drinking addiction, one that held her down for many years, and she has finally been sober for quite a few years now. And as she shared on Catherine Schwarzenegger's podcast called The Gift of Forgiveness, she said that one of the key elements in her becoming sober and being able to move forward with her life was, you guessed it, forgiveness. She said that she finally had a conversation with that very friend who abused her years ago. She forgave her, knowing that she herself, that girl, was also being abused. There was a terrible moments of abuse there. So she had compassion on her. And here's where the power is. By forgiving and releasing that girl, she actually released herself. Jessica says that if it wasn't for her faith, she really would not have been able to do it. So why does faith empower you to forgive? Jesus had chosen his 12 disciples, and they walked and they ate with him. They were witnesses of his great power. And as a foreshadowing of the Great Commission, Jesus actually sends them out in Matthew chapter 10. And before sending them out, he equips them with power and with a kingdom principle. This is Matthew 10, verses 7 through 8. He says this, "As you go, preach, saying, the kingdom of God, the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Heal the sick, cleanse the lepers, raise the dead, cast out the demons, freely give as you have freely received." This is the kingdom principle. Freely give as you have freely received. This is what empowers you to forgive. You've received love, give it freely. You've received provision, give it freely. You've received joy, give it freely. You've received forgiveness, give it freely. How many times do we charge others and make them pay for something that we freely received? In the last hours before his last breath, Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." Like the debtor in Matthew chapter 18, we want our debts forgiven, and in the same moment, we demand what is owed to us. I'll say this again. Like the debtor of Matthew 18, we want our debts forgiven, and in the same moment, we demand what is owed to us. It's time to give freely what you and I have received freely. Who do you have to release today? Who do you have to forgive? Forgiveness is truly supernatural. And in this process of this episode, there's a chance that you've already thought about one or two people that it's time to forgive. But unfortunately, other people are not always the ones that harm us. Many times we're our own victimizers, whether through self-harm, it could be degrading addictions, or negative comments about ourselves. We can tear ourselves down. I still remember clearly the day I confessed to my parents that I had watched something I shouldn't have when I was young. I had watched an explicit movie scene with my neighbor at his house, and I repented and I received God's forgiveness. But years later to that day, the memories of what I had seen kept coming back to me. And I talked with my mom and I said, Mom, I'm having trouble, even though I've repented, I feel like I've received forgiveness, but I'm having trouble forgetting of what I've done. And maybe you can relate with that. You have trouble forgetting and letting yourself free of what you've done. And she told me this. It's something that stuck with me for a very long time. She said that I've needed to forgive myself. It's true. I hadn't forgiven myself for allowing myself to be exposed to that. I wasn't letting myself off the hook as if it didn't matter, but I was releasing myself because Jesus has already paid the price. He carried my shame and the guilt on that cross. Romans 8:1 says a powerful truth that there is now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. Now, of course, that's no excuse to sin, because Romans 6:15 says, what then? Are we to sin because we're not under the law, but under grace? By no means. But what it does mean is that now you can see your present clearly because you're not being clouded by your past. Uncomfortable conversations can bring change in our lives, and forgiveness is one of those things. Forgiveness is a supernatural gift that brings freedom to your life. Its religious significance through the Bible, through the life of Christ, gives it its weight and power for our daily lives. And when we forgive, it forces us to confront the situation and bring closure, allowing the hurt to stay in the past and not affect your present, as it so many times does. All of this is possible when we understand the kingdom principle of giving freely what we have freely received. Jesus forgave the unforgivable, taking the shame with him on that cross, giving you and I the opportunity to live freely. We'll see you in the next episode of The Andrew Amos Show.